Welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is terrifying, so turn off the lights and listen closely. If you enjoy horror, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and comment which country you're watching from. I want to see where all the brave souls are listening. Now, let the nightmare begin. I've driven across a lot of roads in my life, but there is one highway that I should have never taken, and I wish I could pretend the night I spent on it was just a nightmare, but I still wake up hearing the engine, the wind, and the voices that came through the static. My name isn't important, because I'm not trying to be remembered. I'm trying to forget. I was only supposed to drive 4 hours, drop a shipment at a rest stop, and head back before sunrise. The sky looked normal when I started, the radio worked fine, the mile markers made sense, and everything was just another boring night behind the wheel, until I missed a turn. The GPS recalculated and suggested a faster alternate route through a highway I'd never seen before. The name didn't pop up, and the map didn't even show it until I zoomed in, a thin gray line cutting straight through an empty stretch of fields and forest. I didn't think anything strange about it. I turned and kept going, never realizing that highway didn't exist on any map before that moment. The first 20 minutes were peaceful, quieter than I'd expected. No trucks, no cars, not even a lonely motorcycle passing by. The moon was bright and the fields on both sides were tall, dry grass waving like ghostly fingers in the wind. The road straightened into miles of darkness that seemed to swallow everything behind me. I didn't see a single sign, no billboards, no gas stations, nothing except mileposts that started showing strange numbers, small white plates with 1/13, 2/13, 3/13. 13. I thought that was just the number of miles until the highway ended, but now I know it meant something else. Something more final. Somewhere around mile 4, the radio cut to static, and the highway got darker, like the moon was fading or the night was closing in. I turned on my high beams, but they didn't help. The darkness stretched further than the light could reach, like it was swallowing the road seconds before I drove over it. Around mile 6, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I don't mean headlights behind me or someone tailing me. I mean someone inside the truck, someone sitting in the passenger seat, someone watching me breathe. I kept glancing over at the empty seat, telling myself I was tired, telling myself I'd had too much coffee, not enough sleep, too much night and not enough sense. I tried singing to break the tension, but my voice sounded wrong, like it didn't belong to me. When I looked down at the radio, the screen flickered, and then text replaced the static, "Stay on the road. Do not stop." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a glitch, thinking maybe it was connected to my phone, some weird notification, but my phone was off. I hadn't touched it. I reached for it, and the radio went dead entirely, leaving me with nothing but the sound of tires on pavement and the constant, suffocating silence. Around mile 8, I saw the first car. It was pulled over on the side of the road, hazards blinking, but there was no one inside. The door was open, the headlights pointed into the field, and the back seat was full of old boxes, torn clothing, and photographs. I slowed down, ready to stop, ready to help, but I remembered the radio text. I kept driving. I watched the car disappear in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness like it had never existed. I don't know why, but I felt like if I slowed down too much, something would catch up to me. I pressed the gas harder, ignoring the fear crawling up my spine, ignoring the whisper that was starting in the back of my mind. "You are being followed." Around mile 9, I finally saw headlights behind me, distant, faint, but real. Someone else was on the highway, someone moving fast. I relaxed a little, thinking maybe the highway wasn't abandoned, maybe Google wasn't wrong, maybe I was overreacting. But then I realized the headlights weren't behind me anymore. They were above me, floating in the air, moving sideways across the field, slow and steady, without sound, without wheels, with nothing holding them up. They glided through the trees like hunting eyes, dragging shadows behind them. I slammed the gas pedal, heart pounding, trying not to look, trying not to understand what I had seen, because understanding would mean accepting it was real. Around mile 10, I lost reception entirely. I looked down for just a moment, trying to refresh the screen, and when I looked up, someone stood in the road ahead. I swerved, barely missing him, tires screeching, truck shaking, almost tipping over. I stopped for a second, heart hammering, hands shaking, staring back through the windshield. He stood on the center line, tall, thin, in dirty jeans and no shirt, pale skin stretched too tight, ribs showing, head tilted to the side like a broken doll. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew they were open. I knew they were staring straight into me. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear anything. I floored it, the truck roared, and I sped past him. I didn't look back, not even once. Around mile 11, the road began to curve, and the forest grew thicker, branches arching overhead like skeletal ribs forming a tunnel. The sound of wind changed, no longer a natural howl, but a voice, hundreds of voices whispering from the dark. They weren't saying words, not at first, just sounds, just breaths, just the suggestion of syllables that hadn't been spoken for years. My chest tightened, breath caught, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Something hit the back of the truck. Hard. The whole vehicle shuddered. I didn't see anything in the mirrors, but I heard footsteps on the roof, slow, dragging, heavy, pacing above me as if someone was deciding where to break through. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just kept driving. Around mile 12, the voices finally formed words. They weren't whispers anymore. They were in my head. Clear, direct, spoken in a voice that wasn't human. You shouldn't be here. The road straightened again, and in the distance, I saw a bridge, old, rusted, sagging over a dry riverbed. I drove faster, desperate for anything that felt like an ending. When I reached the bridge, I saw a sign, small, rusted, hanging crooked on a single nail. I only caught it for a second, but I read it. Mile 1/13. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe I missed something. Maybe there were two bridges. Maybe I was turning onto a different highway. Until I looked in the mirror and saw my own tire tracks, already there, already fading, already old. I hadn't escaped. I had looped back around. The highway didn't take me somewhere. It trapped me inside. When I realized I had looped back to the beginning, every instinct I had told me to slam the brakes, run into the trees, or scream until something finally answered, but a deeper, older instinct told me something else. Do not leave the road, do not step into the darkness, because the moment I did, the things that walked through the trees would stop moving silently and start running, fast enough to catch me before I could even turn back. I gripped the wheel, knuckles aching, and drove forward again even though I knew I wasn't moving toward a destination anymore. I was just surviving minute by minute, mile by mile, hoping exhaustion or insanity didn't swallow me before whatever ruled this place did. The mile marker said 2/13 again, glowing faintly in my headlights like a reminder that I was inside something built to loop on purpose, a trap with boundaries I couldn't cross and rules I didn't understand. The air felt hotter, heavier, like the night was breathing directly on my face, and I rolled down the window just to feel something natural, but the wind smelled like damp earth and rusted metal and old blood, so I sealed the glass again quickly, terrified that something would reach in and grab my arm before I could close it. The static on the radio shifted, not to music, not to speech, but to breathing, as if someone was sitting 2 inches from the microphone, exhaling directly into my ears. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment, I thought someone was in the back seat, leaning forward, mouth inches from my ear. But I refused to turn around because I knew if I looked, I would give whatever was there permission to reveal itself fully. I stared ahead, tunnel vision, clenched jaw, trying to ignore the occasional tap on the rear window, soft at first, then louder, rhythmic, like knuckles dragging across glass. It hit again, harder, a pound that shook the frame, and I finally broke, glancing into the mirror, but there was nothing, just the empty back seat and the shifting darkness behind the truck, moving like fog but heavier, thicker, a presence instead of weather. Around mile 4, I saw lights far ahead, flickering, not headlights or brake lights, but something brighter, unnatural, burning with an orange glow that pulsed like it was alive. I couldn't tell if it was fire or something imitating fire, and for a moment, hope stirred in my chest because light meant civilization, civilization meant people, and people meant help. But as I got closer, I understood that the lights weren't buildings or trucks. They were torches, dozens of them, lining both sides of the highway, mounted on crooked posts, burning with flames that didn't flicker naturally, flames that moved sideways, bending toward the road like they were being pulled by something unseen. The highway narrowed between them, forcing me to drive through a corridor of unnatural fire, and when I passed the first torch, the engine started sputtering, dashboard lights flickering, speedometer dropping even though my foot was pressed against the pedal. I slowed to a crawl, praying the engine wouldn't die, because if it did, I'd be forced to stop, and if I stopped, I didn't think I'd ever start again. As I passed the torches, the flames bent further inward, reaching for the truck, scraping at the paint, leaving trails of soot and ash that looked more like claw marks than burns. And between the flames, in the gaps of darkness between each post, faces stared at me. Dozens of them. Pale, sunken faces with empty eyes and mouths hanging open like their jaws had rotted loose. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. They just watched me pass, heads turning in slow unison, following the truck with broken, jerking motions. The air turned colder, and the voices returned, whispers this time, not screams, chanting something over and over, but too quiet to understand, too ancient to translate. When I reached the end of the torchline passage, the engine surged violently, revving to life like it had been choking, and I floored it again, escaping into open road, shaking so badly I had to bite down just to stop my teeth from clacking. The road straightened again, endless, lonely, everything behind me swallowed by darkness, everything ahead swallowed by fog. I passed another mile marker, 6/13. Time didn't exist anymore. There was no clock, no sunrise, no shift company waiting for my delivery. There was only the highway, looping endlessly like a living maze, feeding on my fear, shaping itself around it. I don't know when I realized it, but at some point, I understood that this road wasn't abandoned. It was fed, and I wasn't the first meal. I don't know how long I drove before I saw the next car, but when I did, it was worse than the first. It hadn't broken down, it had been torn apart. The engine was ripped from the frame, seats shredded, windshield shattered, metal bent outward instead of inward, as if something had tried to pull the inside of the car out. There were drag marks across the pavement, deep gouges in the asphalt like fingernails dug through it, and blood sprayed in wide arcs across the road, still wet enough to glisten in the headlights. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I looked away, refusing to give the darkness my attention, because it was learning from me, feeding on every reaction, every emotion, every mistake. I don't know when the voices got louder, but when they did, they weren't whispering anymore. They were screaming, shrill and violent, filling the cab like a swarm of insects crawling into my brain. I covered my ears, but it didn't matter. The voices weren't outside. They were inside. You don't belong. Turn back. Turn back. Turn back. I wanted to scream back, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. I pressed the gas harder, engine roaring, tires screeching, the truck shaking like it was going to split apart, until eventually, the pavement smoothed, the air cleared, and the voices stopped entirely, replaced by the most terrifying sound of the night, silence. Then, finally, I saw something ahead that made sense. A rest stop. A building. A light. Human structures. I nearly cried just seeing fluorescent bulbs and concrete. I pulled off the road, parked under the only working streetlight, turned off the engine, and waited, holding my breath, listening for footsteps, whispers, claws scraping across metal. Nothing came. The silence felt heavy, thick, suffocating, but real. I stepped out of the truck for the first time in hours, legs shaking, heart still pounding, and stared at the building. A bathroom, 2 vending machines, a row of empty parking spaces, and a bulletin board covered in faded papers. It looked abandoned, but not ancient, like someone had left only hours before, not years. I walked slowly toward it, desperate to feel something human, something normal, and as I neared the bulletin board, I saw flyers taped to it. Missing persons posters, dozens of them, faces of men and women and children, all with the same description beneath, last seen on Highway 13. But that wasn't what made me collapse to my knees. It was the one on the top. A photo of me, taken earlier that night. I kept driving because there was nothing else left for me to do, nothing resembling safety behind me, nothing resembling sanity ahead, just the endless asphalt dissolving into darkness. But the more miles I put between myself and that abandoned station, the more I realized the road was changing, stretching, bending, lengthening like something alive, as though the highway wasn't built over land but carved through some black, infinite space that only disguised itself as a landscape at night. And every mile marker I passed was blank, stripped of numbers, just empty metal stakes jutting out of the earth like improvised tombstones, reminding me I had left the real world behind without understanding when it happened or why. And as my headlights swept across the desolate terrain, I saw the trees thinning, not because they were ending, but because they were being erased, their silhouettes dissolving under some invisible force, wiping the horizon clean, leaving behind smears of ink where trunks and branches had been moments earlier. And part of me wondered if the world was ending gradually behind me like a curtain being pulled shut, erasing everything I could no longer see. And I felt this crawling dread that if I ever stopped, if I let the car stall or run out of gas, the world would simply catch up and devour me too, leaving nothing but the soundless void I imagined existed just beyond the edge of my headlights. So I kept pushing forward, hands shaking on the wheel, throat raw with exhaustion, telling myself I could hold out until sunrise despite the fact I hadn't seen the moon, stars, or any hint of the sky since this night began. Like the heavens had turned their back on this place entirely and left me to navigate a world that wasn't under God's jurisdiction anymore. And as the silence pressed harder against the car, I realized how unnatural it truly was, because silence always has a tone, a texture, soft or still or tense. But this was not silence. This was absence, a swallowing void that killed sound before it could fully form, like the air around me was hungry, devouring every noise except the hum of the engine, which somehow felt too loud, too exposed, attracting attention from things I couldn't see but knew were out there, watching, listening, waiting for a single mistake. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw movement, a flicker of shadow running along the edges of perception, a tall, narrow shape moving with a pace that was unsettlingly calm, as if it knew sooner or later I would slow down for even a second and that would be enough. And when I wiped my eyes to clear my vision, I realized with sickening clarity that the thing following me wasn't running on the road, it was gliding above it, drifting like it didn't need gravity or friction to travel. And that was when the road ahead began to change, rising and falling in smooth, unnatural arcs, banking in curves that felt like I was driving on the ribs of something titanic buried under miles of asphalt, and my stomach twisted as the car leaned with each impossible bend, tires gripping just enough to keep me from spinning into the blackness that waited below. And I knew somehow that if I ever left the road, if even one wheel slipped off the edge, I wouldn't crash, I wouldn't roll, I would fall endlessly into whatever bottomless chute waited beneath this cursed highway, because the darkness didn't feel like the absence of light. It felt like the absence of existence, like a mouth without a stomach, a void without hunger, until something living wandered close enough to claim. And I wondered if maybe the highway wasn't a place at all, but a bridge, suspended between the world I belonged to and a world I had no business entering, and the creatures behind me and ahead of me were simply the ones who patrolled it, enforcing rules I didn't know existed, rules I broke just by being here. But the reality of the situation hit me in a much more human way when the gaslight came on, glowing orange like a dying ember, mocking me with its inevitability, because the car was my only lifeline, and without it I would be swallowed by the vacuum stretching behind me, or dragged into the darkness by the thing that moved without touching ground, or captured by whatever congregation of figures waited in the distance, because I saw them now, lined along both sides of the road, dozens, maybe hundreds, tall and still, spaced evenly apart like soldiers awaiting inspection, their bodies faintly backlit by some pale luminescence that didn't come from headlights or torches or flares, but from their eyes, which burned a cold white, like stars glimpsed through fog, flickering ever so slightly as though adjusting their gaze, tracking me with unnerving patience. And I tried not to look, I tried to fix my eyes on the road, but the terror of what stood silently on each side overwhelmed me, because their shapes were not human, not even close, their proportions wrong, limbs too long, torsos too narrow, heads tapered into points like warped silhouettes of predatory birds given the posture of men, and the worst part was that they stood motionless until I passed, and only after the car moved beyond each one did they slowly turn heads, following me, waiting for something, timing something, communicating in some silent, ancient way. And that was when the radio came alive again, not with music or static, but with a rhythmic breathing, wet, labored breaths like some massive creature was exhaling directly into the speaker, and buried underneath it was a chorus of whispers, too many voices speaking too close to the microphone, overlapping one another in some frantic, whispered chant that wasn't in any language I recognized, but every now and then, through the frantic tones and staggered syllables, a single word would emerge in English with a clarity that made my blood freeze. "Faster," it said once, then again, "faster," and I listened, not because I trusted the voice, but because the shadows behind me were closing the gap, their forms no longer flickering but solidifying, taking shape beneath the dead light of those impossible eyes lining the road. And I understood with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely and settled directly into instinct. If I slowed down, if I hesitated, even for a moment, they would reach me, and whatever they did to those who stopped on this road was a fate worse than death, because death was release. But this place did not offer release. This place seemed designed to entrap, to harvest, to convert, and I wondered, not for the first time, if the highway I had taken was truly abandoned, or if it was abandoned because everyone who took it was never seen again, and whatever was happening here wasn't rare nor random, just carefully concealed from a world too afraid to admit it existed. And as I pressed harder on the accelerator, engine screaming, fuel dwindling, I felt the car begin to shake as if it were resisting the speed I demanded, but the terror of slowing kept my foot pinned, and all the while the road seemed to narrow, the edges sloping downward into a blackness that swallowed light like water swallowing ink, and the horizon warped, bending inward like a funnel, as if the world were collapsing into a single point toward which everything was being drawn. And in that moment I realized something that nearly broke me. This was not a chase, it was a shepherding. I wasn't running from them, I was being pushed, corralled, funneled toward something waiting for me at the end of this impossible road, something huge, something ancient, something the creatures behind me feared more than I feared them, and I understood with nauseating clarity that I was not escaping, I was arriving. I don't know how long I drove after that moment of realization, only that time didn't behave like time anymore, minutes stretching into hours, seconds collapsing into nothing, as if the highway existed outside the flow of any timeline I could comprehend. But eventually the endless line of figures along the road began to thin, their glowing eyes dimming as if they were reluctant to approach whatever waited up ahead, and their absence should have comforted me, but instead it ignited a deeper dread, because if the watchers themselves feared what lay at the road's end, then I had been running towards something infinitely worse, and though my fuel gauge slid below empty, the car somehow kept moving, engine coughing and rattling like a dying animal that refused to surrender, while the radio emitted a low vibrating hum that felt more like a frequency vibrating in my bones than a sound in the air, and every nerve in my body screamed that I should stop the car, abandon it, and run into the dark fields on either side. But when I looked out the window, there were no fields anymore, no grass, no earth, no horizon, only an ocean of darkness stretching outward in every direction. Not night but absence, a void that made the concept of ground feel theoretical, and so I stayed on the road, the only thing tethering me to reality, until the asphalt itself began to change, its surface rippling subtly like thick liquid beneath the tires, each bump sending a shudder through the frame of the car as though the road resented supporting weight, and the headlights illuminated shapes moving beneath it, silhouettes shifting like something massive swam just under the surface, and I felt the overwhelming certainty that the road wasn't built over land but over flesh, a living artery through something unspeakably vast, and I was no longer driving over terrain but along the spine of a sleeping god. But this metaphor soon failed, because the road didn't feel unconscious, it felt aware of me, aware of my presence, responding to my motion, lengthening and narrowing according to my speed like a host manipulating the path of an intruder. And then the highway widened suddenly into a circular clearing surrounded by towering monoliths of stone, each carved with symbols that hurt to look at, symbols that shifted constantly, writhing like worms or serpents etched into rock, and for the first time since this nightmare began, there was light that didn't come from my headlights or the eyes of the watchers, but from the stones themselves, pulsing with a pale blue radiance that cast long skeletal shadows across the expanse. And at the center of this clearing was a structure, a massive archway of bone and metal rising out of the road like a ribcage forced into shape by machinery, and the air around it vibrated with a deep, almost melodic resonance, like a cathedral organ being played underwater. And it was in that moment I realized the truth I had been denying all along. This was not a highway, it was a passage, a constructed pathway built by something that didn't understand the concepts of mercy, morality, or time, and I had not stumbled upon it by accident. I had been drawn here, guided by forces beyond comprehension. And when the car finally sputtered one last time and rolled to a stop directly before the archway, I felt something like relief, not because I thought I was safe, but because motion had ceased, and motion had become terrifying, as if speed itself fed the attention of the things behind me. But the relief was fleeting, because stillness brought silence, and in that silence, the darkness around me seemed to press closer, like a crowd leaning in to witness a spectacle, and out of that pressure emerged sound. Faint at first, a whispering chorus that seemed to surge up from cracks in the asphalt, voices layered atop one another, thousands of voices speaking in a language that was felt rather than heard, a tongue older than speech, and as it rose in pitch and volume, I understood dimly that it wasn't chanting, it was remembering, reciting history, welcoming me not as a stranger but as a participant in a ritual that had been enacted countless times before. And I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely supporting me, my mind shivering with panic, and stepped onto the living road, feeling it flex beneath my feet, as if each step awakened nerve endings that shuddered at my touch. And as I approached the archway, I saw movement above it, a shape too large to perceive all at once, its form obscured by the pulsing light, but what I could see were eyes, not two, not dozens, but hundreds, stacked in vertical rows along a massive form that hovered just above the structure, blinking asynchronously, each pupil dilating and contracting like camera shutters, studying me with clinical detachment, and the realization that those eyes were not watching me individually but scanning me, analyzing me, measuring my worth or my function made my stomach twist with primal horror, because whatever intelligence controlled this place didn't regard me with malice, it regarded me as material, a component, a resource to be evaluated. And as I stood trembling, the voices ceased all at once, leaving a vacuum that sucked the breath from my lungs, and then a single voice spoke, not from the radio, not from the void, but from everywhere and nowhere at once, a voice that carried the weight of mountains collapsing, oceans boiling, stars being born, and it said, with terrifying certainty, "You have been chosen." And I wanted to scream, to deny, to flee, but the voice continued, unraveling the last threads of my sanity. "You are the one who will remember." And before I could ask what that meant, the road beneath my feet cracked open like a splitting skull, and black tendrils shot upward, wrapping around my legs, arms, chest, lifting me into the air as if I weighed nothing at all, and as they pulled me toward the archway, toward the pulsating light that burned without flame, I felt my mind unravel, flooded with images of worlds that existed before Earth cooled, civilizations built by beings with no bones, no skin, no concept of mortality, beings that shaped reality like clay, beings that built this highway not as a shortcut for travel but as a corridor for sacrifice, and I understood, in a moment of clarity that bordered madness, that every person who vanished on these roads, every missing trucker, every broken-down traveler, every unsolved disappearance had not died, but been taken, consumed, repurposed by the thing that dwelled beyond the archway, and I was simply next in an unbroken line stretching back to the dawn of consciousness, and as the tendrils pulled me through the arch into a space that did not resemble space, where light had shape and sound had texture and gravity. Moved like a living river, I heard my own voice rise out of me, not in pain but in awe, because I saw the truth of everything, the history of existence, the machinery of eternity, the endless hunger of timeless gods, and I knew with final, devastating certainty that I would never return to the world I came from. Not because I would die, but because I would become part of the mechanism, another voice whispering in the static, another watcher on the road, waiting for the next traveler, the next lost soul to cross the threshold, and I understood tragically that the warning scrawled on the gas station wall was never a threat, never a lie, just the simplest truth anyone could offer. Do not stop, because there is no escape, only postponement, and as the last fragments of my identity dissolved into the luminous void, my final human thought was not a plea for mercy, or a desperate clinging to the life I had once lived, but a cold, resigned acceptance that someone, someday, somewhere, would drive this road again, alone, afraid, unaware, and I would be the one waiting.